Have you ever inspected the source code of an interactive element like an accordion and wondered what all those aria information mean? What I'm referring to are those aria-expanded, aria controls, aria labeled by, aria selected, and so on. In this video, we'll attempt to answer that question by first understanding what name, role, and value is all about in the WCAG guideline. The name, role, and value is a way to provide a complete description of an element. The easiest way to visualize it is by taking a look at a questionnaire. So assume you have a questionnaire that you've given to your users and you're trying to find out what billing cycle they prefer. So do they prefer monthly or annually? How will you present that in a questionnaire? I'm assuming you have the question that says something like billing frequency or billing cycle. Then you have multiple choices. So the first choice will be something like monthly, then annually. Then the user can just tick one of those choices. So if you now want to represent that as name, role, and value, the role is multiple choice, which can be translated to a radio button. Then the name will be the billing frequency or billing cycle, and the value is whatever the user selects. That becomes the value. So now let's go ahead and see that visually. So visually, we have a radio group, which is the role. Then we have the billing frequency, which is the name, and the value is whatever is selected by the user. Now let's go ahead and inspect this code and we'll see it visually from the accessibility tree. So for the semantic elements, I've used field set and legend. The field set now has a role equal to radio group. The legend becomes the accessible name, and the values is whatever the user selects. Let me go ahead and check the tree. So you can see this is the role and this is the name. So the role is radio group, the name is billing frequency, and then the value is whatever the user has selected. Although when it comes to HTML, this is an element, then what is inside also becomes an element. So you can see we have the radio again. So each of those radio, they also have their name, their role, and their value. So their value now becomes, are they checked or not checked? So we are basically having an element within an element. The radio group is an element that has the value as whatever is selected. Then each of these radio inputs becomes its own element again that has its own name, role, and value. So for the monthly, the name becomes monthly, the role is an input with a type equal to radio, and the value is either checked or not checked. So this one now, the value is checked, the other one, the value is not checked. But then they're now grouped into another element, which is called the radio group. So that is how we come with the elements. This is just a simple use case. So we always have name, role, and value. You always have to think about it that way. And everything should make sense when you read it back to yourself. That means the name, role, and value, when read together, should become meaningful. If the name, role, and value, when read together, is not meaningful, then you need to change one of those items. For example, let's say instead of saying billing frequency, I said annual billing frequency, and then I give you two options. That doesn't make sense anymore because I've now put the value inside the name. So in that case, if I say annual billing frequency, I might have to change the values to be yes or no, something like that. So you have to make sure that the name, role, and value make sense. So for that, we'll now use the second example of an accordion and try to break down what everything means, and that will give you a better understanding of name, role, and value, and then you can start understanding what all of those aria attributes mean, and you can go and research it more on your own. So now let's take a look at the accordion. So here we have an example of an accordion. I basically took this example directly from the W3C pattern, and you can think of an accordion as a set of heading and content. So we have heading, content, heading, content, heading, content. But you don't want to overwhelm your users with too much content. So you basically hide the content until the user clicks on the heading. So that heading now expands and reveals more content. An example use case is when we have our FAQ section. So we have a list of questions, but there are so many questions. We don't want to have all of the answers open at once. That might overwhelm our users. So we're trying to condense everything so that the user can just only see the headings and then quickly jump to the answer that he wants to. So in that case, this is how it works as well. So thinking of it visually, so we have a heading and a section of content underneath the heading. Heading, section of content, heading, section of content. And now we are trying to make it easier for our users to understand. So now visually we can see that all we have to do is click to expand, click to collapse. So we click to expand, we can expand all of them, and then we can collapse them. So now how can we translate this action to a user? That is the whole purpose of the aria information. The aria information is simply telling the user that what they are seeing visually, we're trying to now tell them in a text form. So visually, we have a heading, and then we have some content underneath it. So this is basically a heading, like maybe a H2 or whatever. Then we have content there, which is a section of content. And we're now having a control. So something that controls the heading to either open or close on click. So what can we use to identify something that is triggering an action? The role that is best suited for that is a button role. A button role communicates that we are going to be performing an action. So that is the first thing we need to think about. So first, we already have that this is a heading and this is a section of content underneath it. So heading and content. But then a heading just only gives you a title. Now we're adding some controls to it. The best way to add controls is by using a button. So inside of the heading, we'll now wrap in the heading a button element to tell the user that he's going to be performing an action, either with the mouse or with a keyboard. Then the next thing we need to now do is now communicate to the user that the action we are performing is expanding or collapsing a section. That is where the aria-expanded comes into play. So the aria-expanded now tells the user that we are basically expanding a content to give us more information or collapsing that content. So that's why when you now go ahead and inspect it, you see that we have the basic structure first is heading, and then we have a section. So that's why the heading and then a role equal to region to identify that this is a section of content and this is the heading for that section of content. The next thing we are doing now is we have something that is triggering an action. So whenever we're trying to trigger an action, we use a button role. If we're going to link to a new page, we use an A tag. So make sure you use the tag that describes what the action is. If we cannot use the tag itself, then we have to look for what is the role that best identifies it. So that's why you can see things like role equal to button, role equal to region, and so on. Because in this case, they didn't have the right elements to use. Instead, they now have to use a role equal to region to tell us that, okay, this is a region of content that has a heading H3 that is connected to it. So that is the first step with the HTML elements. Now that I've gotten all of the HTML elements intact, the next thing is the aria-expanded. That now basically tells the user that, okay, this button, once we click on the button, it's supposed to create an expansion of a content. So that's why we use aria-expanded. The next thing you need to do is now tell the user that the button is controlling what section. Because we're just saying it's expanding. What exactly is it expanding? We need to know what is expanding. That's why we now use these aria controls. These aria controls now tells the user that the thing that is being expanded is the section that is directly underneath that button. So that's how it keeps going. So we're trying to like just inform the user of every action that we are trying to take. Then to make the user better understand the section as well, because we have given it a role equal to region, that means it is now a semantic element. We're now trying to explain, okay, this region, what is the name of the region? So we now basically redirect it back to the button. So we're now saying the section, whenever we have any kind of role, like a role equal to region, that means it is a region of content and it needs to have a heading. Ideally, the heading is supposed to be directly inside the region. That now gives the region an accessible name. But because the heading is outside of the region, that's why we're now using this aria labeled by to connect the heading back to the region. So it now connects it back to this name. So the button gives the region an accessible name. The aria-expanded tells the user that the content that is directly below the heading is expanding or collapsing. Then we use these aria controls to tell the button, because the button is not inside of the section. If the button was inside the section, then we may not need these aria controls because the button and section already have a link. Right now, the button and the section don't have a direct link. So that's why we're using these aria controls to tell the user that the button is controlling this section. And so on. So that's how we can basically understand all of these elements. When you see anything, when we have like a link with a drop down, the same thing, when we click that drop down, because the drop down icon is dropping down a set of content, that's why we also use that same thing of the aria-expanded. So it's expanding a content, but usually the content should be directly below the button or should be linked to the button in some way or form. So the name, role, and value basically just helps the user to understand the full context of that element. So yeah, I hope this simple explanation has helped you to have a better understanding of the name, role, and value. So basically, the thing you need to remember is the steps are, first, you need to know what you're trying to accomplish. Once you have an idea of what you're trying to accomplish, then you can now start adding the proper role, because for any action you're trying to take, so if it's going to be something that has multiple choice, you use radio button. If something that the multiple choices are not like, the user has to choose only one. So maybe the user can choose, there are multiple choices and the user can select 2 or 3 or more of that. You use the checkbox and so on. So the action determines what semantic elements that you use, and then from there you start adding the extra. So you start with the role. What is the role? Then you add what is the name. So either with text content, I explained more about accessible names in a video which I will link to in the description, and there should be a link popping up somewhere so you can better understand what name is. So first you start with the role, which is determined by the HTML elements you want to use. Then you get the name, and then finally, if the name and the role is not enough to explain the action, especially when we are using something that has to do with JavaScript. If we're not using JavaScript, then usually the name and the role should already explain the elements to the user. But when we're now creating our own components using JavaScript, so like accordions, tabs, and all of these things that is using JavaScript to control them, then you need to inform the user of those changes. So if there is a change in expanding or collapsing, then you use the aria-expanded. If there is a custom select field, then you need to also do the aria checked and all of that. So to explain to the user what exactly is happening. So I hope this simple explanation has broadened your understanding. I'll be taking a look at each of those individual aria properties in future videos so that you can understand it better. So thanks for watching. Please do leave a thumbs up if you like the video. Anything you want me to explain further, please let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.